continue and follow along with Bob and Doug until they're out of that capsule, as again, they had started loading fuel onto the Falcon 9 rocket, so they'll have to wait until all that fuel comes off. They'll disarm the launch escape system, which still stays armed because they're still sitting on a partially loaded rocket. And then once they're able to disarm that launch escape system, the crew arm will swing back out. They'll make their way once again back the way they came, and then it'll be back to crew quarters for Bob and Doug for a few more days. But if you're just now tuning in, wondering why we're not still counting down, we did have a launch scrub today. We were just a little under 17 minutes.
Stage 1 LOX and fuel flow rates are nominal for offload. Expecting about a 40-minute offload time.
And so that call out, the LOX, the liquid oxygen fuel pumping out of the first stage of the Falcon 9, everything looking good with that. Expecting about 40 minutes for all that fuel to come off. So again, once that fuel comes off, Bob and Doug will be able to disarm the launch escape system, and that crew access arm will swing back out. They'll be able to make their way back down and then over to crew quarters. So unfortunate scrub today because of weather. That was the one thing we were tracking from the moment we started today, watching Bob and Doug get suited up for their launch. We did abort today's launch, or scrub today's launch, with a little under 17 minutes to go until our T0 time, which was 4:33. So that's going to move us to our next attempt, which is coming up on Saturday, and that time is going to be 3:22 p.m. Eastern time, so a little bit earlier in the day for Bob and Doug and for everybody else watching around the world. They're still going to have a 19-hour flight to station if that's when we launch, and a lot of the stuff that we saw today is going to look very similar, but we're just going to have to try again, cross our fingers, hope for a little bit better weather the next time.
And again, this goes with every launch. We do track everything all the way down to T0 to make sure that everything is go, making sure that the range is go, weather is go. So this is standard procedure. We always tend to make sure that we have a backup day, launch day, in case we do have scrubs like today. So this is pretty normal and standard. Nothing to be worried about. Again, we do this for the safety of our vehicles, as well as today we had astronauts on our vehicle. So even bigger reason for us to make sure that we have safe weather for them to fly.
And just a reminder for everyone still tuned in, it takes about 40 minutes for all of this propellant to come off of the Falcon 9. And while it is offloading that launch escape system on Dragon, which is designed to pull the capsule away if there's any issue with the rocket or anything on the pad, that is still armed. So we're going to continue to stay with this until all the propellant's off, and then we'll see the launch escape system get disarmed. Bob and Doug will be able to open up their visors again. The crew access arm will swing back out and link up with Dragon, and they'll make their way off and then down the tower at the pad. But if you're just now tuning in, no launch today. We did have to scrub because of weather. We're going to be moving to our second attempt on Saturday, just a little bit earlier in the afternoon. Just going to continue to stand by as this propellant comes off. We heard a call that everything was going nominally or as expected so far. And then once all the propellant's off, we should see Bob and Doug make their way out of Dragon shortly after.
And what you're seeing on your screen is a live view of Bob and Doug on the right side inside of Dragon as they're waiting for propellant to be removed from the vehicle so that it is safe for them to disarm the launch escape system. And this will take a bit of time, so we are going to stay live with you to watch this as they exit the vehicle eventually and come down from standing down on launch today.
Up until the point of the scrub, we had a really clean countdown, weren't tracking any issues with Falcon 9 or the Dragon spacecraft, so always a good thing to see. We did have to scrub because of that weather. To be a little bit more specific, we were still in violation of one of the weather criterias. It was the strength of electric fields in the atmosphere that the 45th Space Wing and other weather operators are monitoring around the launch pad. And that's one of those rules where we need a certain amount of time if we're in a violation. In this
offloads are
case,
nominal, ropely 50% on stage 1 locks and fuel, 85% on stage 2 fuel.
so the propellant offload on Falcon 9 continuing to go well. But we needed a little bit more time if we were going to be able to clear that launch weather constraint. And since we do have an instantaneous launch window today, we weren't able to make it. So we hope for better weather coming up on Saturday, where again our next launch attempt is going to be at 3:22 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll be able to go through everything. I mean, we saw them get suited up. They had a great ride out to the pad. All of their initial checks on both the suits with pressure checks and communication checks went well. Able to get the Dragon hatch closed, the launch escape system arm, and Falcon 9 started its fueling. Just not able to make a good weather window today.
And as John and I said earlier, it was just another great rehearsal today. I don't think you can get enough practice doing this. So when Saturday comes, or when the day that we can actually launch the vehicle, Bob and Doug and the NASA and SpaceX team are fully prepared with just an extra rehearsal on the belt now.
As we had talked a couple of times throughout our countdown, the weather is a lot more complex when we're launching humans. You have some more stringent requirements in place, not only around the pad, but in the case of this launch today, we were also looking at whether the entire ascent corridor, as we call it, so basically the entire way that they were flying up the east coast of the United States in this launch today, we're monitoring that weather because those are areas that if they have an ascent abort, or basically Dragon firing off of the Falcon 9 while they're flying into space, we have to make sure that conditions are good in the sea states around those areas, just so they're not going to be landing in the middle of a hurricane, which we did have a tropical storm forming right off the coast of South Carolina today, just to help complicate things a little bit.
And people might be asking, if we knew the weather was going to be a little iffy today, why continue to count down? Well, that is the reason why we do all these checks all the way to count down. In Florida, the weather is, pretty sporadic. Sometimes a thunderstorm or hurricane will pass through. Within 20 minutes, it's gone, and we could have clear skies for a safe launch. We continued as scheduled. Standard procedure again to just continue to monitor weather all the way down to the last minutes of the count, and we see what happens. So today, unfortunately, we did scrub for weather, but we will attempt again this Saturday on May 30th.
And Dan, Jesse, a couple of things to add on there. Right now we are 11 minutes after the scrub was called. Liquid oxygen and fuel are coming off of the first stage. Hard to tell from the view. It's still a little misty around the tank because there's locks on board. But we're between half and a third of each of the fuel and LOX tanks filled on the first stage. So propellant coming out right per plan. The second stage fuel tank is offloading. That's going slower, but it's also a smaller tank. It doesn't take very long to either load it or to offload it. The other thing that we're working on is the high pressure helium spheres, as well as the nitrogen spheres for the landing leg system. The pressure will be brought down on those, eventually getting it down low enough to where people can re-enter the pad area. So right now the team is preparing, once they get a permission, the SpaceX ingress-egress technician team will come back inside the caution area around the pad, make their way up when conditions are right, open up the hatch and assist the astronauts out of the Dragon. I'd like to point out that for those who are wondering whether or not, having gone through this, putting propellant, pressurization gases on, getting fairly close to launch, whether that has done anything to wear out the Falcon 9 or the Dragon, the answer is no. If you can recall, the Falcon 9's designed for at least 10 flights, and about time we get up to a 10th flight, we'll be doing testing to find that we probably got enough margin to keep flying. So this is the very first flight of a new first stage and a new second stage. So we haven't even gotten through the first flight. And in all of our margin calculations, we also take into account the fact that we may scrub a launch. So even today's operation, where we have pressurized and we have stressed the vehicle a little bit, that's taken into account in our design and our qualification testing. The other good thing is that the most stressing part of the flight for the Falcon 9 on the first stage is the re-entry. So we didn't even get through that. So we're sitting here on the pad. It's a fairly straightforward situation and not stressing on the Falcon 9. And on the Dragon spacecraft, with the human rating factors to carry crew, there is enough factors of safety, margins of safety, redundancy, that just having 2 people on board and closing the hatch and even pressurizing the propellant system does not eat into the margins of the
Offload's
vehicle
continuing nominally, 30% on stage 1
So
launch,
right now
35%
everything's continuing to
stage 1
offload.
fuel.
The automatic sequences that we use routinely, both at the launch sites, Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, even Vandenberg Air Force Base, as well as in our Texas test site for first and second stage. Those sequences are running. Propellant is coming off of the vehicle per plan. And we see Bob and Doug up in the Dragon spacecraft, just waiting when we can get up there, open the hatch, and help them egress and come on back down the tower. And the other thought I had, Dan and Jesse, is right now we are coming up on what would have been T0. And I'm wondering 10 minutes from now whether the weather officer would turn around and say, yes, it turned good. You just didn't have a long enough window. We only had 1 second and we needed 10 minutes. So we'll have to ask offline and say, hey, did the weather conditions improve? And one thing I'll tag on to that Dan was mentioning and Jesse was talking about, the launch opportunities. The launch window does move earlier on Saturday a little bit. So it just happened to be Orbital Dynamics said today, if you want to go to the International Space Station and you want to launch northeast, which is the approved trajectory, you have to go right at 4:35 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. You pick another day, the T0 moves. It's just luck of the draw. We might have been doing this at 8 in the morning when we were getting lightning, or we could have been doing it a few hours from now when conditions may have been acceptable. So in the end, we can all look at Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler for orbital dynamics telling us when do we launch, and that stuck us right in the middle of a period of bad weather. So there's my science lesson for today, Dan and Jesse.
Appreciate that, John. That helps soften the blow of just moving past that T-0 time. But for anybody, if you're just now tuning in, wondering why Falcon 9 is still sitting there on the pad as we move past that T0, we did have a scrub for weather today, just not able to clear all of those constraints. We keep a very close eye on the weather around the pad and their whole way
Dragon
uphill.
SpaceX for weather.
Right now, Bob and Doug are still inside of
Dragon,
Dragon.
go ahead for weather.
Yeah, I just wanted to give you some more words on the scrub rationale. Yeah, so we basically scrubbed due to 3 rules that we were violating. All 3 would have been expected to clear 10 minutes after our T0 time. And those 3 were natural lightning, the fuel mills, and the attached anvil.
Yeah, we copy, Jay. We appreciate that update. We could see some raindrops on the windows and just figured that whatever it was too close to the launch pad at the time we needed it not to be. So we appreciate that and understand that everybody's probably a little bit bummed out. It's just part of the deal. Everybody was ready today, and we appreciate that. And the ship was great. And we'll do it again, I think, on Saturday.
Copy all. And yeah, we concur. And appreciate your resilience sitting there in the vehicle for us.
We got the easy job. Nothing better than being prime crew on a new spaceship.
Copy that.
All right, some great words from Bob and Doug. They're feeling good inside Dragon. They'll be ready to go when we make our next attempt on Saturday. Right now, we're just still waiting for all of the fuel to come off the Falcon 9 rocket. After
Stage 1
that,
LOX and fuel roughly 20%, and Stage 2 fuel 36%.
and so that call right there, we're still at a little over 20% on fuel, RP1, and LOX, liquid oxygen, on the first stage, and then at about 26% on RP1 on that second stage. So again, it takes about 40 minutes once the process starts, so we should have right around 30 minutes or so until all that fuel's off. And then the crew will get to go to disarm the launch escape system. We'll see that crew access arm swing back into place, and they can begin to egress or get out of the Dragon spacecraft.
And you heard it live, that weather update of what we violated. We were just 10 minutes off, unfortunately, but again, today was an instantaneous launch. And as John explained, it's due to the orbital mechanics and making sure that at the time we launch, it will allow us to get to the space station on time and accurately. So you can see on your right screen, Bob and Doug are patiently waiting. They do still have their visors on and still strapped into their seats. The launch escape system is still armed right now as we are offloading fuel, and will not disarm until prop offload is complete. And this is just to ensure the safety of Bob and Doug and make sure that they can egress safely from the rocket.
And just a reminder today, just this first attempt, we're going to be right back here looking like on Saturday for attempt number 2. Launch America is not going anywhere. still on the track to get Bob and Doug into space, get this Crew Dragon up to the International Space Station. So it's always good, if you're going to scrub, probably rather scrub for weather than an issue on either Falcon 9 or Dragon. And we weren't tracking any issues with the flight systems throughout our countdown today. Everything passed with leak checks on the hatches and the crew suits. All the communications working great. All the teams were ready to go. So as John and I said, always nice to have a little bit more practice, and we'll be right back at it on Saturday.
What would this launch be if it wasn't even more exciting to try and launch today, and now we have to push it to Saturday?
Really got to build the suspense.
Yes. So,
Hey, Dan and Jesse. Another thought crossed my mind while I'm watching the diagram here showing fuel is just about off. First and second stage, we're down under 10%. LOX is also just about off of
Stage 1 LOX
first
is under
stage.
10%.
Yep,
and
we're
Stage
getting
1
the
and
announcement.
Stage 2 fuels roughly 20% each.
Stage 2 fuels at 20%, Stage 1 LOX is under 10%. So just continuing to come off of the vehicle as expected. On the monitor, Bob and Doug continue with visors down. Their launch escape system is armed, as we've mentioned. If there is anything that were happen to go wrong right now, they still have the viable pad abort means, something that we demonstrated way back in 2015 on one of these webcasts when we fired the Dragon capsule using the 8 Super Dracos off of the launch pad, and it splashed down offshore in the Atlantic Ocean. So they're staying there with the system armed until all the hazards are essentially removed and we bring the crew access arm around them. We're standing by a minute. We're going to listen to Launch Director talking to the weather officer.
If you're just now tuning in, we did not launch today. We did have a scrub because of weather, but as we were saying, we are looking forward to trying this again on Saturday. Our launch time on Saturday will be another instantaneous window, so we'll have to have the weather cooperate again, and that launch time will be at 3:22 p.m. Eastern. I think our last weather update put us at about 40% probability of violation. John, I can check me real quick.
Yeah, Dan, what I saw coming out of the Air Force was 40% probability of violation, I believe. It's always tough because they report in terms of violation, and the optimists have to subtract that from 100% to go, hey, 60% chance, I'll plan my picnic. We were listening, the SpaceX launch director, Mike Taylor, was talking to the launch weather officer asking about the 3 criteria that scrubbed us today. It sounds like in another minute or two, the lightning and the attached anvil cloud rules will clear. The field mill rule, charge in the atmosphere, is still bouncing around, and so, hey, we may need several more minutes before that one would clear. So we'd need even longer than 10 minutes in the window today, it looks like, for all the rules to clear. That brings up what I wanted to mention a little while ago. I got lost listening to the weather brief. But there are a lot of folks who are going, why an instantaneous launch window for Falcon 9 and Dragon? Now, typically when we go to the space station, when we do the mission planning, it's an instantaneous window. There may be enough performance in the rocket to launch somewhere in a 5-minute period, but you've got to pick a time in there. But in the case of Falcon 9, once we start propellant load at T-minus 35 minutes, it doesn't matter so much if you can move 5 or 10 minutes left or right, because the whole sequence is scripted. We do the flight analysis assuming that the temperatures of the propellants are below a certain amount so that we know how much performance is available to the rocket, how much margin we're going to have. So essentially, if you start the countdown, 4 hours, 8 hours out like we were doing today, and you have a very short window, once you get into propellant loading at T-minus 35 minutes, you have to go as soon as you get to 0. We don't have the ability to stop the countdown, wait 5 minutes. Now all of a sudden the liquid oxygen starts warming up from 340 degrees below 0 in the ground system, and that changes how much performance you get carrying into orbit, and we don't want to cut into those margins. Now, if we had had something like a 4-hour window, which some communication satellites have, we could actually get down to almost 0, hold the count, detank the Falcon 9, wait a while, it takes us about an hour and a half, reload a whole new batch of cold liquid oxygen and fuel from the big storage tank that we've got there at Pad 39A, and try to launch again. But in that case, you have to be able to launch, about an hour and a half or so later after you scrub. And in the case of the International Space Station, an hour and a half from now, it's nowhere near where we need to be to get to orbit with the performance of the Falcon 9 and the Dragon. So today, it's a combination. We start the day with a 1-second window.
Yeah, just informing you, it's been 2 hours, 30 minutes. But once we get inside of 35 minutes, it becomes an instantaneous window for the Falcon 9, regardless of what the customer may be able to give us. So there's a little explanation for folks who are wondering why we have such a tight window.
Okay,
right now, it looks
copy,
like we are bringing the last bits of fuel off of the stage, and liquid oxygen is just about off of the stage. So things are clocking right along per the 40-minute timeline. Everything looks good, and we'll wait to hear that we're clear, and then when we get the call for Bob and Doug to go ahead and disarm launch escape system, and the crew access arm will watch come back out, center itself around the Dragon hatch, and then the ingress team will go up there and open the hatch.
Thank you for the science lesson, John I.
Hey, no charge.
Much appreciated.
We did hear a quick call to the crew there. We should be just under 10 minutes away from that prop offload completing. It looks like we're just tracking
Stage 2
the
fuel offload
RP1
is complete.
And there we have the confirmation. Stage 2 offload's complete, and we should have now